Today we're revisiting an interview conducted 4 years ago with Ron Delnevo on the ATM industry. Of course, much in the world has changed since then, and we're interested in understanding how the world of ATMs has been affected. Our interviewee, Ron, is widely experienced in the ATM industry. He's currently consulting on a number of major projects, including with Link, a new cash access app in the UK with Synex, Swiss fintech. Ron's perhaps best known for his fierce advocacy of cash as a medium of payment and is director and co-founder of the UK Cash Supply Alliance. He said, cash, apart from being a method of payment, a means of exchange and a store of value, has a crucial role to play in maintaining fragile democracies and the safeguarding of financial inclusion, personal freedom, independence, privacy and choice. Ron, it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Good to speak to you.
So first, the overall question mentioned in the introduction. We last interviewed you 4 years ago. So since then, how has your view of the ATM industry changed, and what are the developments you've seen that are particularly important?
Well, I think obviously we've had the pandemic, which has badly affected cash usage in most markets. Sometimes for no good reason, because there have been scare stories about the health risks of using cash, which have no foundation in truth, quite frankly. But there's no doubt that shopping experiences have changed in the last few years, and people have tended to shop online far more than previously, and therefore cash use has gone down. And since cash, or at least 90% of cash in the UK and in most markets is now accessed through ATMs, that has impacted the ATM industry. So demand for cash has gone down, and to an extent, demand to use ATMs have gone down. But the problem we've got here in the UK is that the reduction in ATM numbers and equally other methods of accessing cash are declining far faster than cash usage. So in the last 4 years, we've lost about 25% of the ATMs in the country. We've lost thousands of bank branches and so on and so forth. And so basically, we're seeing, yes, a decline in cash during the pandemic, now a recovery to some extent as we come out of the pandemic, but unfortunately, a substantial decline in ATM numbers. And I believe that's going to go on because essentially the banks who fund ATMs don't really want to go on funding them now. They would much rather we move towards a cashless society with very few, if any, ATMs.
Interesting point that you raised, and you talking last time with us around how ATMs are becoming increasingly unsustainable to run, and banks were closing branches and were less interested in cash provision. So I'm interested in what you see as being the way forward. And related to this, what do you think the new additions to the proposed financial services and markets bill offer with regards to a solution?
Well, I think as far as the UK is concerned, but perhaps this is true of most countries in Europe, we haven't seen a sufficient expansion in the services offered through ATMs. In some countries, those services are extensive, notably Spain. But in other countries like the UK, we've hardly seen any changes in the services offered at ATMs for the last decade. And that, of course, means that the usefulness of ATMs has not improved. So essentially, everybody believed that with more choice in payments, cash usage would go down and the amount of cash taken from ATMs would go down to some extent. But that could have been counterbalanced by offering other services which the public could make use of and in some cases pay for to make the ATMs more economic. But unfortunately, we just haven't seen that innovation. Now, it's not because the innovations aren't there to be made, because the ATM manufacturers have brought forward plenty of innovations, but they simply haven't been implemented in the main by banks, because the banks really don't want to be making ATMs more useful because they don't want to be operating ATMs at all. So that's one of the difficulties we have. Now, I think what we will see, or hopefully what we'll see from the government legislation, is a serious approach to make sure there's a long-term solution. The government, or rather the Treasury, if you like, acting on behalf of the government, recently said in a document, oh, nothing special is required in relation to cash. Well, I disagree with that. Something special is required in relation to cash, and we need a plan covered by legislation for the next 10 years, not something that in effect is a sticking plaster. So that's what I'm looking for, a 10-year plan that leaves cash sustainable in every respect, the wholesale side of cash distribution, cash access in terms of withdrawals, and also cash deposit. On top of that, we need a Payment Choice Act here in the UK so that retailers and other businesses are compelled to accept cash for in-person payments.
Interesting angle there, and it leads me to the question of where responsibility lies for the provision of cash. I mean, it seems like you're talking about it being a government-led initiative. Do you think businesses need to be compelled into taking this kind of action to ensure that ATMs persist?
Well, it didn't need to be that way, because in certain markets, and I'll quote one which is a standout example, Brazil, the banks themselves took steps long ago to make sure that cash access was safeguarded for people who really need it. Now, in Brazil, they set up many years ago a utility effectively owned by all the banks called TechBan. And TechBan now has well over 20,000 ATMs, all in areas where the public in Brazil are keen to have cash, and cash is still very popular in Brazil. But TechBan have been very innovative. Their ATMs have taken advantage of the new open banking system that we've seen implemented around the planet. And they have not only put out a lot of ATMs, but they have also made sure those ATMs are increasingly useful through innovation. Now, the banks in European countries and in the UK could have done the same, but they've chosen not to. So in the absence of the banks taking a positive approach, such as the banks have done in Brazil, yes, we do need government intervention, because cash is a public good. Cashes have been around for 2,500 years, and we cannot allow narrow commercial interests to sweep cash away just to fill the coffers of those commercial interests, just to increase their profits. So the public interest has to be looked after, and if the commercial organisations won't do that, then the government will have to intervene. Now, as far as payment choice is concerned, specifically, in many states in America now, they have payment choice laws compelling businesses to accept cash. As I've just mentioned, Spain now has just implemented, actually in late May, has a Payment Choice Act. Now, that act doesn't just protect cash, it does seriously protect choice. So in Spain, businesses are allowed to accept only cash up to 30 euros, but above 30 euros, they must accept other payment methods, cards and digital and so on. And above 1,000 euros, they're not allowed to accept cash for money laundering reasons. Now, I think personally that's a little low as a ceiling, but the point is that it's the right kind of thinking in Spain. It's not just looking at cash, but it's looking at payment innovation as well. It's not just protecting cash, but it's protecting the public's right to choose. And that's what we want to see here in the UK.
A lot of sense. And you've touched on some of the opportunities for commercial organisations with cash provision. That self-interest opportunity clearly exists. Is there something you think that's preventing them from making those changes? Or is it simply a matter of time?
Here in the UK, which is different to other markets like America, we very much concentrated in providing free cash withdrawals at ATMs. In America, they had charging ATMs, what we call in the industry pay-to-use ATMs in the 1980s, I believe. And so the American public got used to paying for cash. So it wasn't a major shock for them to pay for cash at ATMs. Here in the UK, we have had pay-to-use ATMs for quite a long time, but there's been significant media and political agenda against them, so they've never been allowed to flourish, which I think is unfortunate, because in a situation where the banks don't want to operate free ATMs, it would be useful to have more pay-to-use ATMs. But the reality of it is that the ATMs we have in this country already could be more economic if some of the innovations that are available had been implemented. Take cash deposit. Cash deposit is becoming a major issue here in the UK because bank branches are closing, well, literally every day. In the town in which I live, we've lost 4 of our 5 bank branches, that's Leatherhead in Surrey, in the last 15 months. And that's kind of typical of what's happening around the country. So the opportunity for cash deposits, which affects, yes, individuals, but also more particularly businesses, are actually disappearing. So for 5 years now, Link has had a transaction available for cash deposit, but no bank has implemented that. No bank has implemented it. So it means that at the moment, there are very few ATMs in the UK that accept cash deposits, and those that do only accept them if you're a customer of that particular bank. So you can go to an HSBC ATM that accepts cash deposits. You can deposit cash there only if you're an HSBC customer. So that clearly is not the best way for the whole country. The best way for the whole country is if every ATM accepts deposits from customers of any bank, quite frankly. And that could easily be implemented, but they've chosen not to. Now, if that had been implemented, there would have been a small payment through the link interchange to the organisation accepting the deposits, just as there's a link interchange payment for cash withdrawals at the moment. And that would have made ATMs more economic, but it hasn't been implemented. So there's all sorts of things that could have been done that haven't been done. Check deposit is another thing. About 7 years ago, 8 years ago, David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister, I think we'll all remember, not necessarily happily, but he had the bright idea that ATMs in the UK, like in America, should accept electronic deposits of checks. So it would basically take a photograph of the check, the ATM, and that would be enough to allow you to deposit the check. You wouldn't have to take the paper check to a bank branch and so on. You wouldn't have to deposit the paper check in the ATM. So Cameron asked for that, the Prime Minister asked for that to happen, but then the banks appointed a IT company that promptly went bust. And then David Cameron lost office and the whole thing just died a death. In America, when Bank of America introduced that innovation many years ago, it was voted the single most useful innovation the bank had ever done at ATMs. So why didn't we see it here? So there's the picture. ATMs have been kept narrow in terms of the services they've offered because basically the organizations running them don't want to run them. And in that sense, I'm talking about the banks. If the banks had wanted to run them and wanted to make them more economic, they could have been as innovative as the banks have been in Brazil and indeed in other markets like Spain, where you can do many transactions at your own bank's ATMs. I mean, one of the banks in Spain was even operating a pawn shop through their ATMs. Almost unbelievable. But you could also buy sports tickets, you could pay your parking fines, you could pay for your parking to avoid having parking fines, and so on and so forth. So why haven't we seen that innovation? We've had in the ATM industry a project called the Next Generation ATM project. Well, where are they? Where are these next generation ATMs? We've been talking about it for years. And, I'm a man of action. I don't like talking about things. Well, I do like talking about things, but I then like implementing. Where is the implementation? Where is the innovation in the UK? And the answer is we haven't seen it. And we need it now, desperately.
Makes sense. We've talked about some of the banks, what they're doing, or more actually what they're not doing. When we last spoke with you, you were talking about ATMs not necessarily being operated purely by banks. There were new entrants into the market, IADs, these kind of players who are going to play an increasingly important role. What have you seen in the last 4 years?
Well, we haven't seen many developments. We've seen, as I said earlier, a reduction in ATM numbers, but we've basically got the same operators that we had 4 years ago. And I think myself that I've come round to the view that we need a utility in the UK to operate ATMs, just as they have in Brazil, and they have had for 30 years in Brazil. I just don't think you can leave it to the banks for the reasons I said earlier. And the independent organisations haven't really stepped up in the way that one would have hoped. And so if we're going to make sure that cash is safeguarded in every respect, and that payment choices therefore safeguarded. I think we probably need to see a utility created, and that utility would be responsible for making sure there were ATMs everywhere they're needed in the country. So that's basically in every community. The biggest danger that we've got is that, for example, Link recently introduced the cashback without purchase scheme. Now, my worry about the government legislation is that it may include something along the lines that, as long as you're 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres from any access to cash, then that's adequate. So perhaps if you live outside a large village, and the village has a number of shops and bars, and one of those shops and bars offers the Link cashback scheme, they may judge that to be enough. Well, it's not. We need a more comprehensive approach to that. Perhaps if every single retailer and bar and restaurant in a community offered a proper service in terms of access to cash, maybe that would be a significant contribution to meeting the cash needs of that community. But if the legislation is de minimis and simply says, you just need one source of cash in every community, well, that's simply not good enough. And why? Because, for example, ATMs are actually electromechanical devices. They fail and they go down, maybe a day or 2 or 3 or more a month in some cases. They also have cash outs because there's a peak in demand, or the cash delivery company fails to make a delivery. So the ATM is down. Well, if that ATM is the sole source of cash in the community, well, that's not adequate, is it? Equally, if you turn around and say, well, we haven't got an ATM, but there's a post office, well, what do you do after 5:30 in the evening when the post office is closed? Yeah. And similarly with cashback, the way it's currently operating, that one cashback outlet doesn't have more than a couple of £100 in their till, possibly. Once they've had 3 withdrawals made, they've no cash left to give out. And the customer has no way of knowing whether there's going to be cash there or not. All of this introduces uncertainty, instability, and makes the public anxious about cash. And that's not what we need. We need the public to be given confidence that cash will be available for them to withdraw, and also they'll have access to deposit facilities.
Much more comprehensive approach to cash provision is what's needed, is what you're saying. I wanted to end by urging you to make a hopeful message. If there's one development in the time since we last spoke that's given you reason for hope, promise for the future with regards to cash provision and ATMs, what would it be?
Well, actually, I could say that the government is contemplating legislation because it's taken long enough for that to happen. I've worked in the ATM and payment industry for 30 years, and we waited 30 years for legislation, and we now need it more than ever before. I believe that we've got a 2-year window of opportunity. If we don't sort out the issues within that 2-year window, then we will have real problems with the whole cash situation here in the UK. Cash access, cash deposit, cash use, the whole thing will be in a very powerless state. So we need to sort things out now. I think, to be honest with you, the most hopeful thing to me has been the resilience of cash after the pandemic. UK finance is forever telling us that we're moving to a cashless society, and more people are not using cash. But if you look at the small print of those survey results, basically, the last time I looked, UK Finance, which is the bank trade union effectively, they said that 13 million people in the UK use cash once or less a month. And that's what they call somebody who's basically become cashless. Well, there are 53 million adults in the UK. So if 13 million are using cash once or less, it means that 40 million are using cash. That's more than 75% are using cash more than once a month. So that is a very hopeful sign, considering we have all these alternatives now, and they're brilliant alternatives. The cards industry with its contactless technology, the Apple Pays, Samsung Pays, and so on. This is brilliant innovation, but still cash is heavily used in the UK. And if you look at the recovery, we're now back to the public taking about 75% of the cash in terms of value out of ATMs that they did before the pandemic. Now, the fall off in transaction numbers has been higher than that, but people are now taking out more money. 10 years ago, the average withdrawal from an ATM in the UK was £55. Now it's getting towards 90. So people are going less often. Now, of course, one of the reasons they're going less often is there are fewer ATMs to go to. So now when they find an ATM, or they're maybe at the big Tesco or Sainsbury's or Asda or whatever, I better mention Morrison's there to ensure good competition, any of the big supermarkets, they think, well, I'm only going to come here once the next week or 2 weeks, so I'll get more cash now than I would have in the past, because that's a way to ensure I still got cash. So, you know, nothing has changed in terms of my belief that the UK public want to have cash. When they're actually asked the question specifically, do you want a cashless society? More than 3/4 of people say no. And that is echoed in those figures, that over 40 million people are using cash more than once a month. And I think that needs to be, firstly, appreciated, and secondly, honoured. Honoured by the banks and other organisations involved, including the independent ATM operators, but more especially honoured by the government, because those 40 million people are voters. Now, if you remember years ago, Margaret Thatcher unwisely introduced the poll tax because she just thought, well, the British public would accept that and I can impose it and there'll be no problem. Well, there was a massive problem. And in the end, a regime change in this country resulted from that failed policy. And I actually think that the government are in danger of underestimating the public's belief and trust and wish to use cash. And if you look at the situation, over 50% of people wanted Brexit in the UK. What use is Brexit without the pound and cash? Because that is the only UK payment method. Everything else is owned by companies and other organizations based in other countries. So if you believe in the independence and you believe in taking back control, you must believe in cash. And I don't think the government should underestimate that. And if it gets to the stage where cash is under grievous threat, there could be a massive reaction from the public to that, not unlike the reaction we got in terms of the poll tax. And I really believe that. I believe that people are underestimating the value of cash to the British public and how much the British public appreciate it. We've had cash for 2,500 years. I have a coin in my office here that's 2,500 years old. And why has cash survived for 2,500 years? Not because of banks, not because of governments, not because of anything else, but the public's belief, trust, and continuing wish to use it. It's the same today as ever.
Ron, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. We really
Lovely
appreciate
to speak to you. Thank you very much, Ben.
it. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.